Thank you very much, Goran, for the introduction. So the purpose really of my presentation is to present the results of the RESPA regional study that we conducted last autumn. In a way, I'm also presenting the RESPA approach in action that Fatos just presented, in the sense that we heard yesterday about the approach from DG Employment, we heard about the approach from SIGMA, we heard about the approach now from the Council of Europe, from KDZ. So we have a number of different approaches to public administration reform and assistance in Europe, inside the EU and for accession countries. And of course, one question we might ask is whether RESPA should have its own approach. But of course, we would want it to complement the other approaches. However, I do think that there is something specific in the way the RESPA approach is evolving at the moment, because it is something that is focused on a bottom-up perspective that really tries to involve those on the ground who are working in public administration in the countries. Let me outline for a moment how we have designed this study and how it has come about. The focus is, first of all, on human resources, but in the context of human resources management, we focused on merit recruitment, which means that we become very, very narrow. However, merit recruitment is arguably the key component of any civil service system, especially when you want to establish a merit civil service system. If you don't have merit recruitment, you won't have other components of the civil service professionalized. Second, we try to focus on implementation. There's a lot of talk about laws, and especially when you speak to the international organizations, the adoption of laws and regulations is often a key indicator of success. However, the law is only the first step. What really matters is practice at the end. It's that something changes on the ground. It's behavioral change. Therefore, implementation is our focus, which doesn't mean that we ignore laws. We start with them, but we want to go one step further. Next, when we focus on recruitment, we are trying to unpack the procedure in order to identify where is the weakest link in the procedure. Is it at the stage of approving positions, at the stage of systematization already? Is it at the stage of advertising positions, at the stage of examination or the final selection, in order to see where is the problem actually? What we found, for instance, in our study is that advertisements are rarely the problem. They are rather found in other stages of the process. The key part, however, I would think for the way RESPA has approached this last year and also in one of the other projects, is to take this bottom-up perspective. So what we are trying to do is to work with the communities of practitioners, in this case on human resources management and development, that RESPA undertakes or manages, coordinates. We try to involve regional experts from each country, but it really means that we have the direct contacts from the human resources management services or authorities or the Department of Public Administration. They have different names in each of the countries. What we try to do in addition to that is to run a survey of personnel managers in each of the institutions that are covered by the civil service law. It means that for us, the unit of analysis is not really the country, but it's the organization, because we believe that there's often a lot of variation and diversity within a country. You may have some so-called islands of excellence, and you may have other institutions that struggle to professionalize their civil service, including their recruitment system. And finally, what we try to do is to come up with general recommendations as well as with country-specific recommendations that each country can take forward and to work on it on its own. You will also see that we don't have rankings. In a way, rankings are something that we like for public debate and for presentation, but in reality, I believe they are often fairly counterproductive, because we should rather try to identify the problems on the ground and look for constructive solutions to address them. So therefore, this is just the way we have approached it, and I hope this might be an example for other cases in the future. Now, looking at our findings, in a way, it echoes what I said at the very beginning. When we look at merit recruitment in the region, it has been formalized in essentially all the civil service laws. There are, of course, differences in the way it's been done. This is often a question of detail. What is, I think, very important to notice for the region is as well that implementation does occur. We do not have a problem of rule evasion in the sense that rules are simply ignored. This is not the problem of the Western Balkans. If you look at Latin America, completely different context and continent, there you also have the adoption of civil service laws, but their rules are often entirely ignored. This is not the problem of the Balkans. However, Despite the routinely application of formal rules in the area of recruitment, what we still find is a perceived ineffectiveness of those rules. This ineffectiveness is often related to the fact that political interference persists. Professional standards seem to be low, even though the rules are applied. That is a paradox, first of all. We wouldn't expect that to happen. We find that lots of non-merit criteria actually seem to run alongside the merit and the professional criteria. And finally, there is a sense that varies a bit across countries and certainly across institutions within the countries, that there's a sense sometimes about a lack of fairness and a lack of efficiency, in the sense that rules are often perceived to be too cumbersome and they take too long to actually solve the real problem. Now, let me try to illustrate first the nature of the problem with respect to non-merit criteria and political interference, and then I'm going to give you some ideas about the obstacles that we found on the ground, given our bottom-up perspective. Now, our survey of personnel managers, we had some 260 responses, altogether a response rate in the area of 60%. So for any survey, that's a good turnout, for sure. Some variation across countries, but for all countries it was fine. And when you look at this, we asked initially our personnel managers how important are different selection criteria. Now, you might think there's good news because nearly 80% say that professional competencies are considered when selection decisions are taken, but you would expect that if you have merit recruitment formalized by law. So the really more relevant bars here are the ones next to it, which show that other criteria are routinely considered as well when taking recruitment decisions. Support from the political leadership, support from political parties, not just a part, of course, and belonging to an ethnic or social group, which varies, again, quite significantly across countries. Political parties have no official role in the process. So clearly, this indicates somehow the problem of political interference. I give you one example from Bosnia state level, so not Republika Srpska in this case, where we asked who actually sitting in the ministries, place and outside the ministries, is involved in the decision making at the end. And the procedure should be quite unambiguous who has got a role in the decision making process. Now, it was interesting to see that 2/3 of our respondents, and it's a survey, right? In any of these surveys, you will have some form of social desirability bias. So most likely, this is only the tip of the iceberg, because most respondents will have an incentive to underreport political interference. That's the nature of any of these surveys, so we should take this into account. Now, 2/3 still say that ministers play an important or very important role in the selection process. Now, in some cases, this is still justified because ministers have formally a role at the end of the process to select from a list. We might see from a perspective of merit recruitment that this is actually dysfunctional because the minister shouldn't be involved in that selection. It should rather be delegated to a secretary general, as is actually the case in a couple of countries. However, you also see here that some key actors in the executive are involved in the decision-making process that have no formal role whatsoever. Deputy ministers play no role usually. Advisors are not having a formal role, and party functionaries certainly don't have such a role. So it means that the actual selection process involves a number of actors that in a way should not be involved in a merit recruitment process. It means that informal norms of how recruitment is taking place are really running alongside the formal process of recruitment. So let's think for a little bit about why this is actually happening there. And we try to be pragmatic about it and not say that this is a problem about parties or politics in the region, but we're trying to look more at what can be actually fixed also in the context of the region. And there are kind of 5 problems that we try to identify. Again, they vary a little bit across the countries, but there are some general trends that we can identify. First, there are problems of regulation in the sense that sometimes regulations are simply incomplete, or we have some kind of incomplementarities. Then we have some questions of examination standards. Often exams are actually taken. However, the examination standards are often too low, and therefore an examination no longer discriminates between a good and a poor candidate, because everybody passes the examination. This is an issue that is tricky because it means that an examination becomes rather a routine, something to legitimize a permanent appointment, but not something that actually tests really the level of skills and competencies. Clearly, we have problems of capacity in the civil service when it comes to recruitment. And these capacity problems are not so much located at the center in human resources management authorities or services, but we are talking about capacity problems in the institutions, where personnel units either don't exist, or when they exist, they are maybe weak because there are few people, or they have a small role, or they lack human resources management expertise. There tends to be fairly little monitoring, external monitoring and internal monitoring. Civil society is only in few countries taking on a role that they are trying to monitor those processes. There is much more scope for improvement. One of the key issues that we found, and it's a fairly simple issue, we could say, problem to fix, are problems of information. We found that commissions are routinely formed in the countries, but the survey showed quite clearly that often some members of the commissions lack information when it comes to running the recruitment procedure well. They lack understanding of the benefits of merit recruitment. And these are usually the ad hoc members of commissions, not the ones that are sitting there on a permanent basis. In some countries, we have so-called independent experts that are co-opted into selection commissions. This is definitely a good thing because it provides new expertise. It provides a monitoring instrument as well. However, the regulation for the appointment and inclusion of those independent experts is often very vague. There's no proper selection of the experts in the first place, and experts themselves lack the information to fulfill properly their role. So there is something very promising, but that needs to be developed. I should also cast the net a little bit further, because in order to make recruitment work and the civil service work, we will need to get the buy-in of the political side, not just a minister or a few ministers, but MPs, members of parliament and political parties in a way need to support the process. And it became quite evident that members of parliament know usually fairly little about the details of the recruitment process. Finally, there is, of course, as I mentioned already, the problem of informal norms and the persistence of some kind of culture of favoritism and political control, and it will be just very difficult to overcome that just by means of rules. It will require some form of training and education. Now, I have summarized this at some length, and I will only briefly add a few points to it, a few examples. The problem of regulation. I give you an example from Serbia, since the minister from Serbia here is as well. In Serbia, you have merit recruitment formalized by law. You may argue that written examinations are not compulsory, but they are optional for many professional civil servants. But one of the key issues is that for temporary appointees, there is no need to run interviews, advertisements, or examinations. As a consequence, often a temporary appointment becomes a path into the permanent civil service. So what we have here is that on the one hand, we have a well-regulated or more or less well-regulated merit recruitment system, but it is partially undermined by a complementary institution, the temporary employment system, which in a way makes it difficult to make the other system effective, because those temporary appointees then have an advantage when they run for a permanent job. You also have this in some of the other countries, so it's not something unique for Serbia. I just use it as an example now. But of course, it would require some form of re-regulation of temporary employment in order to fix a wider problem. I mentioned earlier the issue about the power of the minister at the end of the recruitment process and selection process to make the final selection from a list of candidates. Now, we could say, of course, that the minister has a constitutional right to do so. However, in practice, it often undermines merit recruitment practices, especially if the minister has the right to pick anybody from a list, which can sometimes in some countries be quite long. So that's the kind of regulatory aspect. About the examinations, I have really already mentioned it. I think we can see in the case of Albania, for instance, the new examination system has not only kind of improved or empowered candidates who are now in a position to choose the job rather than the institution choosing the candidate, yeah, in the pool examination, but it has also raised the standards, the level that candidates have to pass before they actually get a job in the civil service. And that is quite important. If you want to have a professional and competent civil service, you need to recruit competent people. So you need to raise the bar for those who come in. There's also a need, however, to cast again the net a little bit wider and to think carefully about what supply of candidates comes from higher education institutions, and to work maybe more closely with public administration institutes or generally social science faculties, and to think about how the skills of future candidates, how the supply of candidates can be raised. This is quite important. If the candidates are better, later on the selected candidate will be better too. I will skip this kind of slide now. I mentioned the issue of capacity already, where we have the issue of often small HRM departments or no departments whatsoever, a limited role for civil society. There are some very good examples, for instance, Institute Alternativa in Montenegro that monitors the processes in public administration quite effectively and advertises this as well. It shows the need to involve the public and to bring the message across to public about the need to professionalize. I mentioned the issue about information, and I don't want to go in more detail here, and I mentioned the issue of informal norms. So to conclude and to wrap up here, we can derive from our study some form of conclusions where we should say, okay, given the context, what's possible, clearly there is still scope for the review and update and upgrading of the regulatory frameworks. The more ambitious reform would be the one that tried to raise the examination standards, yeah, thinking about the Republika Srpska as well, where we have an examination that runs outside, that is separate from the actual selection process of the civil servants. If that were an examination that would be ambitious and at a high level, then it would properly screen skills and competencies, and it would only allow those candidates into the civil service that have passed a high enough threshold. This is potentially quite an ambitious reform. And finally, I think as a general point, there is a need to reach out and to try to bring in the political class into the reform process, and in a way to try to educate, I don't really like to say that, the political class, and to convince them and to persuade them of the benefits of a professional public administration, because if the civil service is not professional, they undermine themselves in a way, because they undermine trust in public institutions. On this note, let me stop here. Thank you.